populist, a young senator willing to break with the old ideas and the old elites in charge of both parties. Hawley partnered with Bernie Sanders in calling for $2,000 COVID relief checks after Trump took that stance. And some of his positions, including his very justified attacks on the power of big tech, are shared by many on the left. But Hawley is also a calculating politician who many believe is positioning himself for a presidential run in the post-Trump era. And he has decided that the best way to do that is to show that he is willing to overturn a Democratic election and American democracy itself in order to keep Republicans in power. Hawley announcing today that he will object to the certification of some states' electoral college results on January the 6th, when Congress is scheduled to ratify Joe Biden's very legitimate victory. It's a move opposed by Mitch McConnell because it means that every Republican senator will have to go on record and vote to either side with Trump and take a stand against American democracy, or instead defy the Trump base by acknowledging the legitimacy of the election result. That's because if a single senator, as well as a member of the House, objects to the Electoral College totals, lawmakers will have to vote on whether they agree to the objection. Now, there's virtually no chance for such an objection to succeed, since Democrats control the House and will not vote to overturn Biden's victory. But a number of Republican House members have said they will object anyway, and now Josh Hawley has as well. And to be honest, Hawley has done us a favour, because while many Republican senators still haven't publicly accepted the election results, none had gone this far. Hawley has now outed himself as the lead plotter in the Senate in Donald Trump's attempted coup. It's a scarlet letter that should follow him forever. He's gone on record against democracy, and he's forcing the rest of the GOP to go on record too. It's important to understand how unprecedented this is. As we noted earlier this week, not a single Democratic senator objected when Al Gore was declared the loser of the 2000 election, even though there was a much more credible case for the election having been stolen then. And when House Democrats objected, citing the incomplete vote count in Florida, it was Gore himself, who was presiding over the proceedings in Congress, who shut down the challenge.
Mr. Vice President, there are gross violations of the Voting Rights Act from Florida.
And
I object, and it is not signed by a senator.
The chair thanks the gentlewoman from California on the basis previously stated. The point of order may not be received.
We should also note that after the 2004 election, there was one Democratic senator who did object, Senator Barbara Boxer of California. But it was a very different situation. John Kerry had conceded, and Boxer made clear she wasn't trying to overturn the election, but rather to spotlight problems in Ohio, such as voters being forced to stand in line at sub-precincts for 10 or even 12 hours. What Josh Hawley is doing is very different. Donald Trump continues to insist that the election was stolen from him. Last night, he was rage-tweeting deranged attacks on Republican officials in Georgia who won't steal the election for him, including a claim that the Secretary of State's brother, quote, works for China. Turns out the Georgia Secretary of State does have a brother, but he has nothing to do with Chinese tech companies or voting machines. He's just an ordinary guy. Then today, seemingly in response to Hawley's announcement, Trump tweeted, January the 6th, see you in D.C. On what basis is Josh Hawley contesting the election on the 6th of January? Georgia just finished yet another audit of its results that confirmed once again that Biden won and that there was no fraud. Trump's crack team has not been able to find evidence of fraud anywhere else. And their legal challenges have been laughed out of the courts again and again. At one point, they lost cases in 6 states in a single day. And look, it's one thing for some of the most infamous Republican backbenchers in the House, the usual suspects, to play along with Trump's coup attempt. Nobody expects much else from these people. But Josh Hawley is supposed to be a smart guy, the future of the GOP. I happen to think he knows what he's doing in trying to undermine a legitimate election. He just doesn't care, because he thinks it'll help him win over the Trump base. Hawley is a self-styled populist who loves to rail against the elites, despite being a member of the elite himself. The senator attended Stanford University and Yale Law after graduating from prep school. And is there anything less populist than telling more than 81 million Americans that their votes shouldn't count, so that he, Senator Joshua David Hawley, can scheme his way into the Oval Office come 2024? For some perspective on all this, I'm joined now by Yale University history professor Timothy Snyder, author of On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. You have been sounding the alarm bell about rising authoritarianism, fascism for many years now. What do you make of this latest development, a sitting Republican senator aiding and abetting Donald Trump's ridiculous attempt to overturn the election?
The thing that strikes me most, and maybe the thing which is the most shameful and dangerous, is the endorsement of the big lie. Senator Hawley knows that the claims he's making are not true. He knows that he is, in effect, endorsing a conspiracy theory. He knows that what he's doing is endorsing a story in which Mr. Trump is the victim. Mr. Trump has been stabbed in the back. And from the point of view of American history and American voters, the tragic thing about this is that the real victims in the history of American voting are the people whose votes are not counted, African Americans historically. And the way Mr. Trump's story runs is that it's those Black people, it's those people in the cities who stole the election. So what Mr. Hawley is doing, and this is what's shameful about it for him, I think, as a young man, as a white man, it's shameful to stand up there and endorse the claim that Black people voting is fraud. But in addition to the moral shame of it, there are the political consequences. When you make claims like this, you're basically saying the other side is cheated, and so we're going to have to cheat the next time around.
Yeah, very true. And some people, when we talk about cheating, let's just get our language straight here. Some people say we shouldn't call this a coup or a coup attempt. It's hyperbole, they say. But what I don't get is, what should we call an attempt by the sitting president and his party in the legislature trying to overturn the result of a free and fair election that was called almost 2 months ago?
I think there's no problem at all calling this a coup or a self-coup or an attempted coup. The only thing which is a little bit different about this, historically speaking, is how much of it Mr. Trump broadcast in advance. He spent 6 or 7 months before November telling us how he would try to throw the election after November. And he did basically all the things he said he was going to do. I mean, for people who think the military has to be involved, it's not for lack of trying. In early June, Mr. Trump tried to bring the military into the streets of Washington. He's been talking to General Michael Flynn, who, of course, as we all know, advocates a military coup to carry out a military-run election. He's tried basically everything. But I'd also emphasize that the way that democracy goes down isn't always in some kind of flash of lightning or gunpowder. It's often by way of a technicality, like the kind of thing that's being organized for January 6th. Where you take some rule that's meant to be a little thing and you push it as far as it can possibly go and break the system that way. So taking the opportunity to render an objection and using that as a way to question the whole system, that's the breaking of norms. That's the stretching of rules, which undermines democracy.
Indeed, it does. And it doesn't matter whether it succeeds or not. People say, well, it's going to fail. Well, who cares? Attempted robbery is still a crime and something we should call out. What do you make of Senator Josh Hawley specifically? Because I've always worried that the real long-term threat of authoritarianism, of fascism even, is not from Trump, but from someone who comes after Trump, who combines Trump's rhetoric and policies and the doors that Trump has opened with a more acceptable face and less personal baggage.
Yeah, you're making a great historical point. I mean, very often the authoritarians we remember in the past had someone who went before them and paved the way, and that someone then gets forgotten when the next person comes along. I mean, look, Mr. Hawley is somebody who ran for Attorney General of Missouri in 2016, complaining about ladder-climbing politicians. 10 months later, he announced his run for the Senate. 2018, he becomes a senator. At this point, he's basically auditioning for president. And so we have to realize that what he's doing is not just a challenge to the system, it's also a form of self-dealing, because the situation in 2024 is very possible. Namely, the Republicans control the Congress. Mr. Hawley is the Republican candidate, and he loses the presidential election, but we get to do Operation Crybaby a second time around. So what Mr. Hawley is doing now is making that scenario more thinkable and more plausible. He's setting up a plan B by which he himself can become president after losing a presidential election. That's one more thing which is wrong about this.
I think you're right about that. Timothy Snyder, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. Thank you for your insights into Operation Crybaby indeed.